donc bienvenue à cette lecture de Bob Stein, qui est organisée en collaboration avec PILEn et iMAL et Pacte. Merci au PointCulture de l'accueillir. C'est une lecture qui s'intègre dans un programme que Pacte et iMAL ont préparé pour cette année, qui inclut des expositions, dont celle-là, Welcome to the Future, qui est en ce moment à iMAL, et qui présente une sélection de CD-rom et d'œuvres sur floppy disk, et aussi un programme de workshop, dont un sera en avril, du 8 au 11, où Ben Fino-Radin du MoMA à New York va donner des conseils pour préserver des œuvres et des documents qui sont sur des formats obsolètes, et aussi un symposium en novembre où un panel de gens venant de différentes institutions culturelles, de musées, vont parler de leur pratique de la préservation des œuvres computer-based et sur support numérique. Je vais switcher en français ou en anglais. So, thank you, Bob Stein, for being here. Bob Stein is the founder and co-director of the Institute for the Future of the Book and founder of the Voyager Company. The last 13 years, he produced more than 300 titles under the Criterion Collection, a series of films on Laserdisc and other carriers, I think. More than 75 CD-rom titles, some are in the exhibition right now at iMAL, including the CD companion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, We Built America, and the Voyager edition of Macbeth. Previous to Voyager, Bob Stein also worked with Alan Kay in the research group at Atari on a variety of electronic publishing projects. And he has also worked 11 years on a project called Night Kitchen to develop authoring tool for the next generation of electronic publishing, and that work is now being continued at the Institute for the Future of the Book. So Bob Stein will make his presentation, and then we have other panelists that will join him, and we will have a round table where you can also ask questions, and you can also ask questions after the round table. So I leave the sound to Bob Stein now.
I'm so delighted to be here, especially having just been over at iMAL and seen a breathtaking presentation of a history that I know a tiny bit of. I think of all the pieces that were there, I don't think I've seen more than 85 or 90% of them. The nostalgia word is up there because I just want to make it really clear from the beginning that I'm not nostalgic about the past. I have a lot of colleagues who are, and I fight it quite hard, because the reality is that what we're doing is we're inventing the future, and what we do makes a difference. And to get lost in the past is useless and hopeless. By the way, I think I should tell you, this talk may be a little rough along the edges. It's a talk I've never given before, because nobody ever asks me to talk about the past. And so what I find I want to do is to contextualize it in terms of the present and the further past. You'll see. By the way, if I say anything that makes no sense, or if somebody can't resist, raise your hand now. We don't have to wait till the question period. So the CD-rom era emerged from a very complicated landscape. It turns out that there were a lot of long-term basic principles that motivated us, and as I'll show you in a minute, there were some short-term affordances that sort of moved us in one direction or another. And this next slide, I think I would have shown here even if this weren't in Brussels, but I can't resist. I think I'm now I'm basically starting the history of where we are today with the work of Paul Otlet, and I have a little video here. Whoops.
Belgian Paul Otlet believed that world peace could be achieved through a global sharing of knowledge. He and Henri Lafontaine began summarizing information, classifying and cross-referencing it in a world palace of knowledge that ultimately held 15 million entries on cards and microfilm. When people sent questions, Odelet's staff searched the archive, retrieved information, provided query results, and most significantly, suggested cross-referenced or linked data, much like a search engine does today.
Does that building still exist? Is there a museum here for Otlet? No? Okay. So after Paul Otlet comes Vannevar Bush.
At the end of World War II, American scientist and engineer Vannevar Bush published his concept for the Memex, a device to augment human memory and index information. He believed people could navigate information quickly if the process of cross-referencing was automated. The most essential feature, Bush wrote, was the process of tying two items together. Information would not be organized by traditional categories, but by free association, one of the ways the brain links information.
I apologize for the silly music. I didn't put it there. So I actually had never heard of Paul Otlet till fairly recently. Vannevar Bush, in the world I came from, was sort of the starting point. And the thing is that when you hear about Bush, what you hear is that he wanted to organize all of the world's information for people to access. What you don't get is sort of the deeper reasoning that motivated him, which was really trying to create a mechanism for humans to work together and to have their efforts enhanced by machines. And that was, then the next person, Doug Engelbart, sort of takes that to the next step. Oops.
American engineer and inventor Douglas Engelbart read about the Memex at age 20. Years later, working as an engineer, he wondered if computers with those tools could be interactive machines for navigating knowledge and augmenting human intellect. It was a radical idea. But in December 1968, Engelbart and his team at Stanford Research Institute publicly unveiled their experimental online system in what became known as the mother of all demos.
Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center.
For 90 minutes, the stunned audience witnessed many of the features of modern computing for the first time. Live video conferencing.
Hi, Bill.
Document sharing.
So he's sitting in mental park looking at this text, and he can point to it.
Word processing.
Lo and behold, I have another one.
And then this completes sort of this section. This is a map of the first 4 nodes on the internet in 1969. University of California, Santa Barbara, the Stanford Research Institute, University of Utah, and UCLA. I like this slide a lot because what it points out is that the purpose of the internet from day one was to put people in touch with each other. And if I look back at the last 4 slides I've shown you, the guys who were, and they were guys mostly, who were pushing and energizing those of us who came along later, they had very philosophical goals in terms of enabling a new level of human collaboration. And machines were going to be the way that they were going to energize that. So fast forward to about late 1970s, and realistically, most of what these men had talked about, and the internet had not really happened yet. We didn't have the browser. The browser didn't exist yet. We didn't have, you know, decent word processors. We didn't have a lot of things that these guys were proposing in the 60s or even earlier. What we did have was the beginning of the interactive video era that came out of MIT in the late 70s.
I can get a definition of these words just by touching them, and the definition will appear in the illustration corner. I can get back to the illustration, but in this case it's not a single frame, but it's actually a movie of someone coming into the frame and doing the repair that's described in the text. The two-headed slider is a speed control that allows me to watch the movie at various speeds. And
forget this slide. I want to talk about the last one for a minute, but doing the split screen the way I'm doing, I don't know how to do both. That demo, which I think I saw in 1980, was very important. Two reasons. One was that was a television screen. It was not a computer screen. They had just invented anti-aliasing at MIT, and it was the first time that any of us had seen text on a television screen that was legible. And so that by itself sort of blew me away. And then that video comes on the screen, and I suddenly realized that the static book page with text and or pictures was suddenly opened up to a whole new level of possibility, and we were going to expand the notion of the page to include audio and video. So that was really what got me, and I think a few other people started. The next sort of the other aspect of interactive video that was very important was in this one. This was from 1980. It was really a demo disc that had been made by Universal Studios, and I'll play you a minute of it.
Some things on the disc happen very quickly. In order to see them more closely, go back and play them in slow motion, or stop them altogether. Now coming up is the Kid Disc Countdown Gizmo. Always wait until you see the end, and then stop the picture. Once you've stopped, use the still button to go forwards or backwards, step by step, and see lots of different jokes and picture puzzles.
There's a place in here where there's a trip to a zoo in about, I don't know, 300 frames, and I noticed on one frame there's a picture of a gorilla, and with his mouth closed, and on the next frame he has his mouth open. And with a video disc player, you could just flip back and forth between those two frames. And which trivial on the one hand, on the other hand, we were playing with video, and that nobody had ever done that before. For me, I think that the first National Kid Disc and the work at MIT, what they helped me to understand was that I had to think a lot. I got a job at Encyclopedia Britannica, and I had to think about their future, and I had to think about the book and why would you bother to transform a book into an electronic medium. And the breakthrough for me came when I stopped thinking about books in terms of their physical nature, that they're ink on bound paper, and started to think about the way they're used, and realized that books at the time were the one medium where the user, the reader, was in complete control of the experience. I could read a paragraph as often as I wanted to. I could flip back and forth instantaneously. You couldn't do that at all with a video tape machine. It was painful to go backwards or forwards. But on a video disc player, all of a sudden, we found ourselves starting to read movies and motion pictures the way we read a book. You'd watch a scene over and over again. You'd freeze something. You'd watch it in slow motion. We were becoming active readers of video in a way that had never happened before. And I realized that what was happening was that if I called books or user-driven medium, all the other 20th century media, you know, movies, television, radio, they were all producer-driven. You sat in a chair and they just happened to you. But I realized that what was happening with, as microprocessors got in the middle of everything, that all of these traditionally producer-driven media were going to be transformed into user-driven media. And that was going to just make a huge difference. So the next and last thing, like, there's probably a zillion things, but one more thing that really made the sort of the CD-ROM era possible was the development of tools. And the first tool that came along was Hypercard, and for the Macintosh. And you'll have to believe me, I failed physics for poets. That's physics for dumb people in the United States. And I couldn't program then, I still can't. But with Hypercard, you could just sort of say, go next card. If this card, then that card. And so I started to write some very simple things. And I wrote a prototype of this Beethoven CD companion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And Amanda Goodenough, who was even probably less computer literate than I was, wrote the Amanda stories in 1987. So you had a situation where two people who were not technically minded or driven were able to express themselves in ways people hadn't before because of Hypercard. And these two programs, which we showed in 1987, really did start something, because we showed them at separately, we weren't together. We showed them at Macworld in 1987 at the launch of Hypercard, and gathered a huge amount of excitement. And I think the first most important person who got excited out of this were the Miller brothers, who did Myst. But before Myst, they did a very important program called Cosmocosmo, which you can see over in the iMAL exhibit. After Hypercard, we got Macromedia Director, and this was very important because Macromedia Director provided enough tools that artists started to get interested. And so you get the Residence Freak Show, you get Laurie Anderson's Puppet Motel, you get the incredible work from Eric Swenson and Keith Seward of Blam, you get Anti-Rom from England, and you get dozens and dozens and dozens of interesting artists' work. And I guarantee you the best collection probably we'll ever see is over at iMAL right now. So this was great stuff. But I think it's important to understand that CD-ROMs were interesting, but they were basically an evolutionary dead end. They just were never going to go anywhere. And for me, we didn't know then why that was the case. I think because we had lost touch by the early 90s with where we had come from. You know, the Engelbart, Kay, Vannevar Bush, Ted Nelson, they had started us in some ways, but we'd lost touch by the 90s. And when CD-ROMs died, I think it caught us a little bit by surprise. But in retrospect, the answer is pretty obvious to me. The deep promise of the digital era is connectivity. And I mean connectivity in two ways. One is, in terms of fundamental, is putting people in touch with each other. And the other is that it allows people to follow their imagination. You're reading something and a light bulb goes off in your head, and you do a search, and you're on to the next place, and then on to the next place. And being able to follow your imagination and your interests is a profoundly valuable and empowering tool. And CD-ROMs, as cool as they were, had no sense of connectivity. And it's interesting, this is sort of a tangential comment, but I would argue that the app world that has developed in some ways reproduces some of the worst aspects of the CD-ROM era, which itself was a holdover from the print era, in the sense that in the main, apps tend to live, on their own, inside of their own little cocoon, not connected to the rest of the internet. It's very hard to be inside of an app and do a search, et cetera, et cetera. It just never feels right. It doesn't work yet. I think that if the browser had come 5 years earlier, it's quite possible that the CD-ROM era might never have come to pass. I think that, and I was saying this to Eric a little while ago, in 1980, those of us who'd gotten excited about the potential of new media just jumped in. And in 1980, all we really had were interactive video discs. It wasn't until 1989-ish that we got a CD-ROM even. But when we did get it, and then when we got QuickTime a few years later, these were fantastic tools, and we explored as much as we possibly could. It shouldn't have been surprising to us that those sets of tools were never going to take us where we really wanted and needed to go. I don't regret that period at all. We learned fantastically important things that will, stay with us and we'll keep working on. But for me, and I think others, the really exciting thing happened was when the internet got good enough to start publishing on the net. Because then the real power, the ability to put people together in the context of work became something we could do. So I was really lucky in about 2004, the MacArthur Foundation came and they said, we really liked the publishing work you used to do at Voyager. We'd like you to go back into publishing. And I said, yes, but I don't know what it means to be a publisher now that the internet is here and ready. And so, but they gave me a lot of money to think about it. And I hired a bunch of young people, and we sat around a table for a year and talked about the problem of what to do. And basically, we threw multimedia out the window as being something that we had taken it as far as we could in the CD-ROM era. There was nothing new we could do with multimedia, really, in the internet phase. But if we were willing to go down the bandwidth curve, we could start to do something pretty interesting. And the first experiment, this is not going to work well. Maybe it will. No. How do I do this? I need to get back to the other screen. It looks terrible, but let's work with that. Oh, that's the wrong one, though. Hold on. Sorry for this, everybody. It was such an unusual talk that I really felt I had to do this differently. And that's not going to work because you can't see everything. All right, let's try it this way. So first, the first project we did, experimental project, was we took a book by a pretty well-known media theorist in the US, Mackenzie Wark, and he'd written a book called Hacker Manifesto for Harvard. He had just written a draft for a new book, A Critical Theory of Video Games, and we got his permission to put his book up on the internet with a dynamic browser. We were just hacking a blogging software where normally the comments would be down below, but Ken writes in this weird way where he doesn't write in continuous text. He writes in sections. He organizes into paragraphs, and 5 paragraphs make a section. So we had to move the comments to the side so that you would know which paragraph they were connected to. And within about an hour of this going online, thanks to Boing Boing, we started getting a very lively commentary in the right-hand, conversation in the right-hand column. And I had nothing to do with the design of this, but I was the one that sort of realized when we did it, and I saw what was unfolding, which was that we had done something really interesting, which was we had flattened the hierarchy of print. With the author up there and the reader down here, we had suddenly made it much flatter. And you could see it over the course of a few days where Ken, who at first was being a control freak, going in there every minute, trying to make sure the conversation didn't get away from him, after a while he started to trust his readers and started to sort of step back and realize that they were all working together collaboratively to understand the subject more deeply. So this was terrific, and we decided we'd build a little tool to work with regular text, which we did. And so this is edition of Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. What you're seeing on the left is one page of text, and what you're seeing on the right is the conversation between 7 women who read this together over a 6-week period. It was quite phenomenal. And this proved for me incontrovertibly that the viability of the asynchronous reading group or discussion that could take place if you put a book into a browser. So these were experiments, and then about 3 years ago, I started working on something called Social Book, which is a platform for social reading, and that really has worked out better than we could have imagined. This is a class of 85 students divided into 3 sections at New York University, and let me see if I can enlarge this a little bit. Yeah. What you see here on the right is this student selected this text, he wrote this comment, 4 students responded to him, and you're seeing one of the threads. It works sort of brilliantly. Every teacher says the same thing. Completely changes the experience in the classroom. The kids come to class having read the material, having discussed it, and so the conversation starts ahead of where it ever used to end up. We have this working as well with movies as we do with expository text. This is a feature-length film. I can put a comment at any point in the time code. And we find that people are having the same kind of complex conversations in the margin of a film as they do in the margin of a book. Let me go back to the keynote presentation before I get completely confused. Okay. Except for some reason we lost our... Okay. Social. I have to say one quick story about social reading. I just love this so much. There were 3 kids who started using Social Book 3 years ago with a teacher, Spanish literature, and for 3 years they did all their homework in Social Book in Spanish. She retired this year, and last spring, and the students, the 3 who were left, who were going to be seniors, all said, "You can't leave. We have to read Don Quixote with you in Social Book." And she said, "Okay, the school will hire me for 1 class. I'll do it." The school did. They are reading Don Quixote together now. The 3 students have put almost 6,000 comments into the margin of Don Quixote. It's the most fantastic thing to watch, and it's particularly interesting to see the students themselves begging to read this way. I will tell you that as cool as social reading is, what we are seeing is that it is a profoundly deeper shift in behavior than people guess. You know, I do demos like this all the time, and people get really excited, and they think, yeah, I'll use this. And then there are 100 reasons why they can't. It's okay. Things take a while to change. We live in a world where the media comes at us all the time, asking us about the latest new thing, and they expect things to change rather quickly. I'm fond of the anecdote that the printing press gets perfected in 1454, but it is 40 years until page numbers start to appear on pages. It's 150 years from 1454 before Don Quixote, which is regarded as the first novel, is published. It takes humans a long time to figure out what new technologies are good for, and it takes quite a long time before emergent forms gel into something that becomes dominant, like a movie, a novel, etc., etc. I do think that multimedia, so there's 2 strands of my work, and I think a lot of us, has been multimedia on the one hand and the social affordances of the web on the other, and they're going to come together someday, and my sense is that it's going to be what we call the game industry that's going to be responsible for that. And I think that mainly because the game industry doesn't have a legacy business that it is protecting the way that the book publishing industry does or the movie publishing industry does. I do need to make a sort of a humorous comment about how clueless the publishing industry is. This was from 2 days ago, this article, about virtual reality and the future of publishing. Now, you probably think that's about how the future expressive forms that publishing might be interested in might have something to do with virtual reality. But it's not what this article is about. This entire article about the value of virtual reality to publishing is that people will make 3-dimensional stores on the internet for people to browse for books. And that is as far, and this, by the way, this was presented as far out thinking on the part of the publishing industry. Legacy thinking is understandable. It is also deadly. I can't resist showing you this. This is from 10 years ago. It was my first experience with virtual reality. I have to explain the setup for a minute so that it'll make sense to those of you who understand games at all. A friend of mine figured out that inside of Halo, which is basically a shooter game, and that each player can record the video of what they're seeing. So he had 2 other people follow him and I as we walked in this 3-dimensional space and talked. And they captured our motion through their cameras, and he also had audio that was capturing what we were saying. So then he edited it all together into a movie which looks like we're walking through this space. And so I'm just going to play you a minute of it.
Come over here for, the photo op on the terrace.
Oh, we need our space here, though. The sense of personal space is still quite apparent, even though it's completely virtual.
It was a little uncomfortable somehow.
What this really reminds me, of course, is Snow Crash. I absolutely can see myself calling my daughter in London and saying, let's go for a walk together.
You mean in an online game?
Right. Where we're actually seeing things that are interesting to us.
One difficulty with trying to transform these places into communal space is just the number of weapons around. They're hard to avoid, really.
Was that plane flying over in the game? Fabulous.
Oh, great. Death from above now.
It's very interesting because I've been thinking forever about, basically how books are going to evolve over time. And when I use the word book, by the way, I'm using it metaphorically. Not the object, but the vehicle that humans use to move heavy ideas around, big ideas around. And that vehicle is shifting from page to screen.
Whoa.
When I started in this 25 years ago, the only really technology we had that was interesting were interactive video discs. So I went to MIT, I remember in 1981, and saw the movie manual where they...
Enough. But it's interesting. There was just this huge debate in a listserv that I'm in, where it was about an article in the United States that millennials, which is a word we use in the States to describe people under 30, don't like to read electronically. And the publishing industry loves this because they think that means, ebooks have plateaued and we're still going to be able to sell expensive books. And I argued, I think correctly, that there are a zillion reasons why young people might not want to read electronically, having nothing to do with whether or not we are eventually all going to be reading electronically. I said the reality is that for a lot of people, the affordances of ebooks aren't good enough yet. There's no reason yet to make the switch. Or for kids, textbooks look terrible on e-platform. A PDF of a textbook is just a disgusting way to try to read. So there's lots of reasons why young people aren't reading electronically. And I said, maybe it would make sense to really think about how we could improve that. And that gets an immediate, no. There's absolutely no reason to do any R&D in the publishing world. And it's too bad, because when you think about it, what I find is in the publishing world that it took a long time for them to imagine screen reading. Like finally that Amazon sort of stole their thunder and did it, and so they had to sort of realize that was a possibility. But if you say to them that this is a transitional period, that the 300-page monograph, the 400-page novel is not going to be the dominant expressive form 20 years from now, 30 years from now, their eyes glaze over. They can't imagine what you're talking about. The fact that somebody might do something in the game world. I have a running argument with a guy named Cory Doctorow about World of Warcraft, which I don't know if you know it. It's a game where people collaborate in guilds, basically, again, to go on quests and shoot each other. But people, 15 million, there was a point where 11 million people were paying $15 a month, and people were playing upwards of 20, 30, 40 hours a week. And what were they doing? They were talking to each other. And I said, World of Warcraft is a form of fiction. I said, the artist, the author, whatever you want to call her, has designed a world that is rich enough that the readers are willing to write the narrative as they go. And I think that's true. And I think that the future of human expression is taking place in the game world. But that brings me to a caveat, and my caveat is almost always via Marshall McLuhan these days. I'm late. I was not a McLuhanite. I'm late to it. But McLuhan has this beautiful passage, which I'm going to read to you in its entirety, that talks about, or at least in the way I'm transposing it into today's world, it talks about the responsibility for those of us who are in this transitional period, who grew up in the print era, but are sort of have one foot in the digital era, the responsibility for us to try to bring what we know that was good from the print era, because it wasn't all bad, and to bring that with us in some way into the future. And I'll read it slowly. This is a beautiful quotation. It's 3 pages, sorry. Had the schoolmen, with their complex oral culture, understood the Gutenberg technology, they could have created a new synthesis of written and oral education. Instead of bowing out of the picture and allowing the merely visual page to take over the educational enterprise. The oral schoolmen did not meet the new visual challenge of print and the resulting expansion or explosion of Gutenberg technology. The oral schoolmen did not meet the new visual challenge of print, and the resulting expansion or explosion of Gutenberg technology was in many respects an impoverishment of the culture. Now, there is no question that we could have an impoverishment of the future culture, and it behooves all of us who have as broad and deep a vision as we do to bring it to bear on the future. And this is the final. There is absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to contemplate what is happening. So, onward. Thank you.